The final part, we're going to be looking at verses 38 to 52. So, we're at the point of completing this psalm as we examine the third major section composed of two movements, just two. An emotional series, this is the first movement, an emotional series of charges or complaints against God for his apparent disregard for the promises of the Davidic covenant. That will be found in verses 38 through 45. Secondly, in verses 46 through 51, we'll see a follow-up series of questions and petitions directed to God. He'll say, "Don't you know?" And then he'll say, "Remember." So it's that sort of thing. So we're going to take up Ethan's lament. We'll deal briefly with the closing doxology in verse 52 as well. Starting in verse 38, reading verses 38 through 45. Again, this is a list of charges that Ethan, our poet, is bringing up. And they're sort of charges. You don't know, maybe he is just simply trying to remind God as a way of influencing God to do what he asks, because he's making petitions. But notice his statement. It doesn't look like it's just, how about remembering this, Lord? He says, "But thou hast cast off and rejected." That's the king in the covenant he's talking about. "Thou hast been full of wrath against thine anointed," which would be the Davidic king. "Thou hast spurned," we get here, "thou hast spurned the covenant of thy servant," the king. "Thou hast profaned his crown in the dust." Whatever it is that Ethan feels God has done, this has, in some sense, profaned the crown, insulted the Davidic crown, and along with it, of course, probably the Davidic covenant as well. "Thou hast broken down all his walls." Now he's going into the king as if he were a military leader, a protector. "Thou hast broken down all his walls. Thou hast brought his strongholds to ruin." In other words, he's saying, not only have you cast off and rejected him, not only are you angry with him, but you actually spurned the covenant as if you're not paying attention to it. Doesn't mean he's rejected the covenant, which some translations use, by the way. But the word just means you've neglected it, or you've been dismissal in it, you haven't paid attention to it, something like that. You've insulted him now, not only him personally, but you've broken down his walls, you've broken down his defenses against the enemy, you've brought his strongholds to ruin. That's probably referring to Jerusalem or other strengths that the king normally counts on to protect against enemies. The king has become a reproach to his neighbors. Then he turns a little bit further. Not only has he made the king weak in some respect, now he's going to tell us, you've also strengthened the enemy. "Thou hast exalted the right hand of the king's adversaries." You strengthened the king's enemies to give them more power. "Thou hast made all his enemies rejoice." And evidently, with the power that God gave his enemies, those enemies must have had some kind of success against the Davidic king. So the Davidic king probably not only is he afflicted, not only is he upset, but he's also evidently been weakened and defeated in battle. We don't see the particulars of that, nor do we know when this is referring to. My personal feeling is that it probably refers to the time either right before or right after the Babylonian captivity began. Because Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, the kingship was now empty. There was no one sitting on the throne of David at that time. Let's go on to verse 44. Thou hast made, thou dost also turn back the edge of his sword. You weaken him in battle, Lord, and hast not made him stand in battle. He can't even stand and fight. I don't know if that means the king had to run or retreat or simply give up. But in some sense, he was weakened for the battle. Verse 44, thou hast made his splendor to cease. The king is no longer the light of the region. No longer is he number one in the region. And you have cast his throne to the ground. This is where we get the phrase in the Old Testament and in Acts 15 in the New Testament, the reference to David's tent being in disrepair. Thou hast, this is verse 45, thou hast shortened the days of his youth. You have weakened him before it was time. He's too early. He should not have been weak yet, but by taking the days of his youth or shortening the days of his youth, we think of that as his time of vigor and success. Thou hast covered him with shame, a last indignity. So in verses 38 and 39, Ethan seems to be directed against God's apparent disdain of the royal grant covenant that we call the Davidic covenant. I use the term disdain. That wasn't the one we read earlier, but it's close enough. Scholars tend to agree that the word reject isn't a good translation of the Hebrew. Disdain or neglect would seem to be a better notion for what's being referred to here. Because God cannot forget or completely reject the covenant that he had made. Remember, this one being the royal grant covenant means that God had to fulfill his side of the bargain regardless of what the king did. Why worry about words? Well, because God's incapable of being unfaithful to his promises, but is definitely able to withhold blessings when the humans fail to follow their covenantal requirements. And Ethan evidently hadn't sorted all of that out. He just said, God, it looks like you're not paying attention. By the way, if you go look at the book of Habakkuk, that was exactly what Habakkuk said. He said, Lord, there's all kinds of evil going on in Judah, and you don't seem to care. You don't seem to be doing anything. I know that's not who you are or what you are. I can't make sense out of this, Lord. So Ethan may be doing something similar to that. Do you remember also that the prophet Jeremiah lodged a complaint against God, much in the same way here? But we don't suspect that Ethan really thought God just would back off, walk away, and let things go untouched, let the chips fall where they may. Because remember how he began this psalm? Verses 1 and 2. I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. To all generations I will make known thy faithfulness with my mouth. For I have said, loving kindness will be built up forever in the heavens. Thou wilt establish thy faithfulness. So, Ethan began by acknowledging the permanence of God's faithfulness and his love. That these weren't things that come and go. That's just who God is. Now, when we go in the next verses in 33 through 37, he's just given us Yahweh's promise, admitting that God's covenant remains intact even when the blessings and privileges are lost because of human choices. Let's read again verses 33 through 37, which was the last portion from our previous session. Starting in verse 33 of Psalm 89. I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. This is Yahweh speaking of the Davidic king. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. In other words, what I said, I've said. I'm not going to change it. I have sworn by my holiness. I've sworn by myself. There's nothing more powerful, higher, or more sacred for me to swear by. I swear on my own personal nature, I will not lie to David. What I said is said. What I said I would do, I will do. His descendants shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. He shall be established ever, forever, like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful. Those were the promises God made to the Davidic king. But nevertheless, look at the emotionally loaded list that Ethan has just thrown at God. I see at least 18 charges. Cast off, disdain, neglect, wrathful, defiled, spurned, profaned, broken down, brought to ruin, plundered, reproach, strengthened enemies, enemies rejoice, blunt his sword, make him run, take his splendor, insult the dynasty, shorten his rule, cover the king with shame. But what's he really saying? Lord, I know you. I can't reconcile this with what I know. I am confused. I think that's really what Ethan is saying here. Certainly it looked like Ethan couldn't reconcile what he believed was happening with God's love and faithfulness, but something had happened to make Ethan feel that way. A military defeat, perhaps, Babylonian captivity, perhaps when there was no one from David's line sitting on the throne, or even no one on the throne, period. Those are all possible things that Ethan could be referring to. Was he? I don't really know. But evidently something did not look right to him, and he didn't understand. Now maybe we don't see it here, but in the book of Habakkuk, God says, now look, Habakkuk, you say I'm not doing anything. It's not true. If you look around beyond where you're looking, you'll see I'm busy. And Habakkuk, I'm going to tell you what I'm about to do, but you ain't gonna like it, because it was judgment on the nation of Judah, which is what Habakkuk was calling for. But Habakkuk was not going to like how God was going to bring that judgment about, namely through the evil nation of Babylon. So it seemed like the tent of David was in fact in a state of disrepair, and Ethan evidently believed God was failing somehow, or he didn't realize how God's promises would be lived up to. Then he moved into a question, followed by a call to remember phase that made everything seem at more of a fever pitch emotionally, as if faith and hope in Israel were turning to despair. It hasn't, the things that we read, the 18 counts that I read to you, if that doesn't seem emotional enough, get ready, because it's going to step up even a bit more. So let's read verses 46 through 51 from our Psalm 89. Well, how long, O Lord, will thou hide thyself forever? Will thy wrath burn like fire? Three questions, right? How long? Forever? Fire? Remember, verse 47, remember what my lifespan is. He says, I'm not going to live forever. For what vanity hast thou created all the sons of the earth? Says it, everything looks out of kilter, Lord. I'm not going to live forever. Can you hurry up and tell me what's going on? Remember about me. Remember your promises. Remember me, who I am, what I am. The same is true for all the people of Israel. Verse 48. What man can live and not see death? We'll look at that a little bit further. Of course, these are rhetorical questions, particularly that one. What can man live and not see death? What man can live and not see death? The answer is, of course, no one. Can he, unless you're living in the time of the rapture, can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol? Can a man deliver himself in such a way or conduct himself in such a way that he will not go down to the grave? And of course, rhetorical questions. And now he asks him to remember, where are your former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which you did swear to David in your faithfulness? Remember, O Lord, the reproach. There's the questions again. 3 questions. Is it 3? Yeah, 2, I guess. Then he says, remember, O Lord, the reproach of thy servants, how I do bear in my bosom the reproach of all the many peoples. This would be as if this were the king asking the questions. Verse 51, with which the bosom of the reproach of many peoples with which thine enemies have reproached, O Lord, with which they have reproached the footsteps of your anointed. In other words, he's still confused. He's asking questions, he's asking God to remember, but he is utterly confused, I'm convinced. Remember, Paul admitted that not all Jews by birth were Jews in the spiritual sense, and that they would be cast out of the Mosaic covenant. But don't think that means God has failed to be faithful in the covenant. That's something that's a little more difficult to see. There's always a tension between the promises of a loving, faithful, just God and the works of the people, and catastrophe that adjoins the works of the people or comes along with the works of the people. There's always a tension there, and many people who have nothing to do with Christianity, that's their main shtick. How can a loving, faithful, just God allow all of this evil, all of this suffering, all of this pain? Well, there are answers to those questions, but to a person who doesn't know the answers, it seems like gotcha, which is not true. Let's look at what Paul said in Romans 11:19 and 20. He said this about Israel. And he's talking to the Gentile believers at Rome. You Gentile believers will say then, branches were broken off, branches so that I might be grafted in. A little history. Speaking of Israel as an olive tree. Some Jews are not, Paul has said, are not true Jews. They are broken off from the trunk that is Israel. But the Gentile believer, after the crucifixion, The Gentile believer in Christ is grafted into and becomes a part of that tree. In other words, if you are a true believer, technically you are a righteous Jew, part of Israel. Verse 20, quite right, Paul says, they were broken off for their unbelief, because of their unbelief. But you, Gentile, stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, because you're in, they're out. Not all Jews are going to be there. A lot of them won't be. Do not be conceited, but fear. Verse 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And verse 22, behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, severity, that be the Jew who's removed from the tree, but to you, the Gentile grafted in, God's kindness. God's severity always has a purpose that supports his kindness, his love, and his faithfulness. Even God's severity or wrath can be an indication that his kindness is intact and it's operable. Now, in a similar fashion, any king of the Davidic line who failed to walk uprightly before God could be removed from the Davidic covenant. God put him in there, God ordained him, God can take him out. But that doesn't mean that God is or will be unfair to that covenant, since David had been warned about that. And he reminded Solomon of that same thing. Let's look at 1 Kings 9, starting in verse 6. I'm going to read verses 6, 7, 8, and 9. This is Yahweh, effectively the words of Yahweh to Solomon. But if you or your sons shall indeed turn away from following me, in other words, he said, you're king, but if you or any of your sons have become king, turn away from me, and shall not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I've set before you, and shall go serve other gods and worship them, then, here's the consequence, I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name, that's the temple, I will cast out of my sight. And what happened at the Babylonian captivity? Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. Most of the top people in the nation were exiled and run out. And if that's true, then God continues, so Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all people. And that's not a good proverb or byword. He's saying, look, if you as kings don't do right, you lead Israel away from me instead of to be tied in with me, then this is going to happen to the nation, not just you, the nation. This house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will astonish and hiss, why has the Lord done this to the land and to this house? And they will say, it was because Israel forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and they adopted other gods and worshipped other gods and served other gods. Therefore the Lord has brought all this adversity on them. So all the Davidic kings were warned that their behavior determined God's reaction within the covenant. The covenant is still in effect? Yes. But things prosperous on the positive upswing? No. Not in the case that you've walked away from God. So think on this. Israel's going to suffer in such a case. The king was probably going to suffer. But any suffering by any Davidic king, what is it? It's a mere shadow of the suffering borne by the Messiah, the final and everlasting Davidic king. Yes, right now David's tent is in disrepair, still is. There's no one sitting on David's throne, and it's going to stay that way until Christ returns. But what about verse 48? Let me go back and look at verse 48 again. What man can live and not see death? Of course, the answer is no one. Can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol, the grave? Answer, no. It's a rhetorical question for Jews. They would have known about this Psalm 49, which essentially makes the same point. So let me read Psalm 49, verses 5 through 9. Why should I fear in days of adversity, when the iniquity of my foes surround me? Even those who trust in their wealth and boast in the abundance of their riches, no man can by any means, catch this, no man can by any means redeem his brother or give to God a ransom for him. For the redemption of his soul is costly, and he should cease trying forever, that he should live on eternally, that he should not undergo decay, for he sees that even wise men die, the stupid and the senseless alike perish and leave their wealth to others. So what's he saying in the midst of this? No man can pay the cost for the sin of another man to redeem him from Sheol. And it would seem reasonable to assume that you can't pay God for somebody else's sin, you can't pay him for your own sin. But in a way you do. If you reject God, if you reject Jesus Christ, then you are going to pay for your own sin. And what is that penalty? Separation eternally from God in very, very undesired circumstances. Weeping, gnashing of teeth, and so forth. But before we move on, Peter made an application of the same idea, the idea of verses 50 and 51, where the poet seems to be disoriented regarding the suffering he sees. Remember we said, Ethan apparently could not reconcile what he thought he knew against what he thought he saw. Now look at 1 Peter 4, verses 12, 13, and 14. Peter is using the same idea of being bewildered. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you. And he's talking to believers, Christian believers, who are in the dispersion, and they are Jews. He said, don't be surprised that there is a tension. You don't think of this fiery ordeal as coming from God. Well, it's among you. And it comes among you, why? For your testing. Don't think of it as some strange thing happening to you. It's natural, Peter says. You may be confused by it. You may not understand it fully, but keep in mind that it is for your eternal benefit, even for your temporal benefit. Even though when we're in the midst of it, we can't see ordeal as helpful, good, or positive. But Peter goes on, to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing. Sounds like James a bit in chapter 1, doesn't it? When you're tested, rejoice, so that also at the revelation of his glory, Jesus' glory, you may rejoice with exultation. Peter's saying, yeah, it's tough now, maybe tough now, but think about it. Eventually, you're going to be able to lift up your heart, your eyes, and your voice in exultation for the goodness of Christ who has saved you. Verse 14 in 1 Peter, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed. Doesn't look that way necessarily, but you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God will rest upon you. And finally, to close out Psalm 89, the third book of Psalms, ending doxology, verse 52. Blessed be the Lord forever. Ethan's not completely out of it. He knows he wants to bless the Lord forever. And the congregation answers apparently, Amen and Amen. Well, we do not know for sure whether those words were of Ethan or they were of an editor putting together the various book sub-collections within the Psalms. Anyway, next up, the 8th Royal Psalm, Psalm 101, 101. Hang with us, guys. It's going to be the 8th. We've got 11 total, so after this, there will be the 8th and 3 more. And we will then move on to something else. Hopefully they're not all going to have the downer segment that Ethan feels, but nonetheless, they will be next. And by the way, you're going to see something. Remember in Psalm 72, it ended by saying this is the last Psalm of David? Psalm 101 is a Psalm of David. So we figured that was an editorial note, uncalled for, but it was there nonetheless.